Hi, everyone, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with journalists and authors about their important work and the stories behind them. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. We're on a bit later today so we can give you the latest on the Supreme Court, which handed Republicans another gift with its decision on the Alabama redistricting case. The court said that the GOP is allowed to change the Alabama map despite a lower court finding evidence of intentional discrimination. So, with less than 6 months out before the midterms and over half the primaries in the country done, we're going to talk about what the fallout from the Clay decision will be on the midterms. And joining us today to help us with that is Zachary Roth, who is a longtime reporter and is now the managing editor of Democracy Docket. It's the news site from elections lawyer Mark Elias, and the site tracks and reports on all the latest on voting rights cases. He joins us to make sense of all of these redistricting cases and other threats to our elections. Zach, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, why don't we talk about this latest decision and what it means? And were you surprised by the Supreme Court weighing in on the Alabama case?
I'd say our newsroom was split about 50-50 on what they were going to do, which is rare. Usually, I think we have a clearer sense. There were reasons to think that they might issue a sane ruling that they had already found this map from Alabama to intentionally discriminate against Black voters, which, as you know, remains unconstitutional even after Calais, and therefore that they would stick with that ruling. But they found a way to reverse themselves on that and rule that, in fact, Alabama was allowed to create this new map because they have an interest in creating a community of interest on the Gulf Coast, and that therefore that supersedes, the fact that this was previously found to have intentionally discriminated, which, as you said in your lead up, a pretty shocking ruling. And I think what really is scary about it is that it seems to now give states absolutely free rein to discriminate against minority voters, secure in the knowledge that the Supreme Court, even in the most extreme cases of intentional discrimination, is unlikely to stop them.
So a lot of the cases that the Supreme Court takes up are complex, and I'm not a lawyer, and most of us aren't. But when you look at the Calais decision and this latest decision with Alabama, I think that what we're hearing a lot from our readers is the fix really looks to be in to help Republicans in any way with gerrymandering. And I'm wondering, from your perspective as someone who has been covering these issues for a decade, is that a fair assessment, or is it more complex than that?
I think that's mostly a fair assessment. The way I might say it is that the Supreme Court has made clear that both in terms of racial gerrymandering, as we saw in the Alabama case and in the Calais case out of Louisiana, and in terms of partisan gerrymandering, where there's not a racial claim, but there's a claim that a map has been written to advantage one party over the other. They had already made clear in the Ruco case out of North Carolina from 2019 that they view that as completely unjusticiable, as they say, something that the courts cannot weigh in on at all. So now, whether we're talking about racial gerrymanders or partisan gerrymanders, the federal courts are going to have almost absolutely no role in stopping states from doing what they want to do. And that, of course, has very big implications for this year's fight for Congress, which we can talk about. But what it also has done is set off a gerrymandering race on both sides, kind of a race to the bottom, where we can expect Democrats next year and in 2028, they're already talking about redoing their state constitutions in a number of blue states, New York and New Jersey. California's already done it. Colorado is likely to do it, to get around some restrictions in their constitutions on partisan gerrymandering so that they can match Republicans, seat for seat. And I think most people on the progressive side understand the need to do that, and that they can't unilaterally disarm. But it's clear that the Supreme Court has created this chaos, and that's also why we're seeing more and more talk about finding a way for Congress to reform the redistricting system once and for all, though that's for down the road.
Well, I know in some of your recent reporting, you call the Supreme Court's Calais decision catastrophic for Black political power. Can you walk us through what this decision has meant for states across the South and what we're likely to see in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important angle because, of course, many of us are focused on the impact on control of Congress, and this advantages Republicans over Democrats, and that's extremely important. But at the same time, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that it's a enormous blow to Black political power in the South, and really, as a number of people are saying, takes us back to a pre-voting rights era when white Southern conservatives had free rein to draw districts and to impose restrictions on voting itself that almost completely shut Black Americans out of the political process. So already, just in the days and week after the Calais decision came down, it was pretty stunning to see Southern state after Southern state sort of rush to say, oh, now that we're out from under the Voting Rights Act, we're going to redraw our map in such a way as to remove majority Black districts. And these are districts, just to explain, that were required under the Voting Rights Act, where Black voters make up a constituency of interest, where they're a large enough group that, according to the Voting Rights Act, they need to be able to elect candidates of their choice because of the history of racial discrimination in these Southern states, and because there's no other way to ensure that Black voters have responsive representation. So we saw Tennessee eliminate its only Black district based in Black majority district based in Memphis. We saw, as we've talked about, Alabama try to revert to a racially gerrymandered map that had previously been found to be intentionally discriminatory, and now the Supreme Court says it can do that. We saw Louisiana redraw its map to be able to get rid of one Black majority district. It currently has two. The plaintiffs in that case, the Calais case, who are still around, are saying, actually, we think this doesn't go far enough. We want the court to tell Louisiana that it needs to get rid of both of the majority Black districts. So Louisiana would have no majority Black districts as well. We saw Florida, which was already in the middle of a partisan gerrymander when Calais came down, sort of use the Calais decision for additional justification to ram through its gerrymander. We saw an effort in South Carolina to do the same thing, get rid of the one majority Black congressional district in South Carolina, represented by James Clyburn, which did not succeed I think honestly, because a number of Republicans had cold feet about spreading out Republican voters too thinly in a blue wave year, as we're expecting, that could endanger some of the existing Republican districts. Anyway, we already saw Texas do its own gerrymander last summer. So the response to Calais really has been pretty shocking in the speed with which Republican-controlled states in the South have rushed to get rid of these Black districts. And just to make a final point on that, as we've written about too, that doesn't just mean, Black voters can't elect the candidates of their choice. That then has an impact on the quality of representation and responsiveness that they enjoy, and whether they have a representative who cares about the economic issues and affordability issues and healthcare issues and poverty issues that affect their lives. And so what we'll be covering closely in the next year or two is how that lack of representation is playing out on a ground level. And that's a piece of this that I think is important not to lose sight of.
Democracy Docket has reported that the lead plaintiff in the case that gutted the Voting Rights Act, Brett Collay, is an election conspiracist. He was there at the January 6th insurrection. And so I'm wondering, how does that detail change the way we should understand this case and what's happened here? And was this really a manufactured case designed to get to the Supreme Court to take out Section 2 of the VRA?
So ever since this case in 2013, Shelby County v. Holder, in which the Supreme Court neutered what was then the most important plank of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, and the strongest plank. That was certainly a manufactured case in the sense that it was brought by a conservative activist group to do that, and a lawyer, Ed Blum, who has led other cases trying to take down affirmative action and a number of other conservative legal causes. Anyway, ever since then, conservatives have set their sights on the next most important provision in the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, and have won a number of rulings that have gradually sort of chipped away at it and narrowed it. And now, in this case, have been able to essentially finish it off. As you know, the court didn't sort of officially say Section 2 is unconstitutional, as some people thought it might, but it narrowed it to such a degree that it's essentially useless. And so, yes, this was a manufactured case. And in terms of the Calais plaintiffs, I think it does. The fact that the lead plaintiff was involved in the January 6th protests, has a pretty extensive online history of kind of extremist rhetoric around voting and spreading false claims about voter fraud and so on. It does suggest to me that on the right, these things are all tied together. There's sort of a fig leaf of we just want to apply the Constitution as it's supposed to be understood, and it bans racial discrimination in all forms. So that means these majority Black districts are discriminating on the basis of race. We really just want everybody to be treated equal on the basis of race. In fact, I think the push to reduce Black political power in this way is very closely tied, as we know, to the push to restrict voting, to make voting more difficult in all sorts of ways, to create fear around voting, to undermine the democratic process itself, which was the goal of the January 6th events.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what the impact of the Clay decision and subsequent rulings will mean for the midterms, because we do have the larger impacts on representation for minority communities and on our democratic system as a whole. But there are real political implications here in a critical election year. Right now, how do you think things stand in terms of how much benefit Republicans will get from these rulings in terms of seats in the U.S. House?
Yeah. So we've been tracking these numbers very closely. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think we can say that in terms of the gerrymandering war that Trump kicked off last summer when he started pressuring red states, starting with Texas, to redistrict. If we consider all of that together, in other words, that stuff that happened before Calais with now these post-Calais redistrictings done by Tennessee and by Louisiana and by Alabama, I think if you include Ohio and Utah, where it was a slightly more complicated situation, the bottom line is I think Republicans have come out 10 seats on top right now. And I think that could go to 11 if the Calais plaintiffs are successful in getting Louisiana to get rid of its final majority Black districts, so 10 or 11. However, because this is expected to be such a Democratic year, I think most sort of political observers are not expecting that they'll realize all those gains. Some of those 4 Florida seats, they likely will not win this year. A couple in Texas that they likely won't win. So it may end up being only 5 or 6 that they benefit from this year. And I think most people who look at this closely would say Democrats are still very much on track to win the House because the margin right now is they only trail by a few seats. And I think they're expected to flip with Trump being so unpopular. They're expected to flip many more. So it may not determine control of the House after 2026. But I think this is a longer story, as we've talked about, and both sides are going to continue now to draw maps to advantage themselves. And it's very difficult to predict how that plays out after 2026.
Right. So, Zach, you've talked about the fact that a lot of Democratic blue states led by Democrats are trying to match the massive redistricting efforts in Republican states that kicked off with Texas last year, and also trying to blunt against, the Supreme Court ruling as well. And so we do have this redistricting arms race that's going on, and it's not going to end this year. And it's definitely picked up a lot of speed in the last decade. What I'm wondering is, when you have fewer and fewer people that feel like they're actually represented by their representative in their state legislature or in Congress, because, the fix is in and, these districts are being carved in such a way for partisan advantage, not to represent communities that have common interests. Doesn't this feed the greater problem of increased cynicism about how our system doesn't work? And ultimately, can this benefit Trump and MAGA in a broader sense, because they've done so much to stoke that kind of cynicism and selling people on the idea that the system doesn't work, so you just have to blow everything up?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think Trump and his movement do benefit from any sense that the system is rigged and that these races are sort of determined in advance, and individual voters don't have the power to elect the candidates they want or to organize it around a campaign and to make change. So yes, that's part of what's worrying about it. I mean, it's easy to sort of blame both sides on that, since this is now an arms race that both sides have joined. It's worth pointing out, first of all, that it sounds simplistic, but Trump started it, so it's perhaps not surprising that it's turned into a two-sided race. But even more importantly, there's been legislation for the last several Congresses introduced by Democrats that the Democratic Party would pass in an instant if they could, to reform the redistricting process.
The John Lewis Voting Rights Act.
That's right. It was part of the larger voting reform, but there's also been individual bills just focused on the redistricting process that would ban partisan gerrymandering and ensure that district lines are drawn by independent people. And that has not gone anywhere in Congress because the Republicans have no interest in that. So that's where we are on it. And that suggests also that they clearly think that they benefit from this situation too, which is an important tell.
Well, you've been covering these issues for so many years, and you had a book that came out in 2016, The Great Suppression. Can you talk with us about how the assault on voting rights has really evolved so much since then?
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote that in 2016, I thought we were in a dangerous situation. And since then, that it was mostly written before Trump even appeared on the scene. So obviously things have escalated since then. I think the biggest change that's happened is there were voices on the right who had made up the sort of voter fraud myth when I was writing, and that was having some impact in the debate over voting. But you did not have the president and the leader of one party and one political movement sort of repeating that day after day from the Oval Office, and therefore influencing public opinion in that way, and getting pretty much half of the country to believe falsely that we have a big problem with fraud and therefore need to make it more difficult for people to vote. And so that idea has now been adopted as part of our debate over voting policy in states across the country and on the national level, in a way that goes way beyond when I was writing. And I think there's also just a lot of norms about how we uphold democracy and fair elections that have since gone out the window. On the gerrymandering front, it was sort of unclear at that time whether the Supreme Court was going to allow partisan gerrymandering. But even if it did, I think there was an assumption that it was not something lawmakers would want to admit to doing, and it was certainly below the belt. Now it's almost, the Supreme Court almost said in its recent decision that we have to allow for a situation where states can gerrymander along partisan lines, so that because almost as if that's such an important interest that states be allowed to do that. So there's just been a complete sort of leveling of any sense of that we need to keep certain safeguards in place to ensure fair elections. That seems to have gone out the window.
So we've talked about the possible impacts on the midterm elections with the House. A year ago, no one was really talking about the Senate flipping because the map is so poor for Democrats, to be honest. But you can't gerrymander Senate elections since they're statewide. I'm wondering, since Democracy Docket spends so much time tracking this, do you feel like as a result of some of these power plays from Republicans in Texas, that's actually really increased Democrats' odds of taking back the Senate this fall?
Yeah, well, we don't cover the horse race as closely
Right.
as some other sites, but I certainly think it's true that in Texas, for instance, where Republicans have nominated an extremist, an election denier in Ken Paxton, it seems clear that Democrats' chances of winning that seat have gone up. In Iowa last night, Democrats nominated a very impressive and candidate who it sounds like is going to give them a chance to compete in a red state. So I do think Democrats not only have now a chance of taking the Senate as well as the House, but to sort of bring it around to our angle, I think the Trump's unpopularity and the Republican extremism on voting and democracy issues has played into that. And we're seeing how Democrats have picked up on the Calais ruling, especially in Black communities around the country, and are leaning into that as a midterms message, which they should, and making clear that the Supreme Court and Republican lawmakers around the country are systematically dismantling Black and Democratic political power. So I do think that is going to come back to hurt them in the midterms.
I know that you have been tracking Trump's extensive efforts to crack down on mail-in voting. This is one of his obsessions. Where are we at on this? Because we learned that the USPS definitely seems to be ready to aid him with some of his executive orders going into the midterms.
That's right. So this was there's a few different fronts, I guess, that Trump is attacking mail voting on, or Trump and the GOP are. There's the executive order that you mentioned, and this was the second anti-voting executive order that Trump has issued since coming back into office. And in this order, he directed the USPS and the Department of Homeland Security to create lists of approved voters who could receive a mail ballot, and have the USPS only deliver mail ballots to people who are on that list. And yeah, we learned this week that even though that order is being challenged in court, the Postal Service is moving forward in drafting and then implementing a rule that would implement the order that would essentially begin to create those lists. So, I mean, election law experts continue to point out that this order is unconstitutional and is going to be blocked in court. It's hard to have 100% confidence in the outcome of any legal proceedings on this stuff, given the political makeup of the Supreme Court that we have, as we've talked about. But it does seem likely that it will be blocked before November. One other way that they're attacking mail voting is through a case that the Supreme Court heard recently,
right?
Which it was brought by the RNC and aims to get rid of states' grace periods for mail ballots, where if you mail your ballot on or by election day, but it doesn't get there until a few days after, as different states have different limits on how many days it can take, the ballot is still counted. Republicans in this case are saying, no, election day is only one day according to federal law. If the ballot doesn't get there by the end of election day itself, it has to be thrown out. It's not clear how the court is going to rule on that, but that already has pushed some states to get rid of their mail ballot receipt deadlines. And we could soon have a situation where I think the 15 states that allow for these grace periods are going to have to get rid of them in the weeks and months before an election, which of course is going to cause a lot of confusion for voters and election administrators, and require people to get the word out very quickly, and will undoubtedly lead to large numbers of voters, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe more, being disenfranchised by this rule. Though this case only talks about, these grace periods of ballots received after election day, it's really an attempt to make the whole process of mail voting more difficult as a whole and disenfranchise mail voters. And it also, by sort of trying to establish election day as one day, I think we expect that if the Supreme Court rules for them on this, the next target will be early voting. Because by that same logic, you can say, well, if election day is only one day, why are we allowing people to vote days and weeks in advance of election day? And there have been signs from the Justice Department and in things that some of Trump's supporters are saying that will be their next target. They want to return to a situation where you vote only on election day and only in person. And that, of course, would be extremely restrictive in terms of who gets to the polls and who can cast a ballot.
Well, election law is set by states and it's enforced at the local level. And so this is really an unprecedented position for this administration, for his Department of Justice to take, for the federal government to try and take such a heavy hand on, the machinery of elections. And I can only imagine that the end result will be a lot of confusion. For instance, in Michigan, where I live, voters went to the polls both in 2018 and 2022, and we overwhelmingly approved mail-in voting, early voting, and expansions of voting rights. And so most of us think that we'll be getting our ballots in the mail because we've signed up for a list. And we're not necessarily paying attention to what the Trump, postal service is going to do. And you could see a scenario where a lot of people are looking through their mail and, the day of the election, they're like, oh, that never came. Why is that? And there's a widespread confusion. But that's one of the points of this, isn't it? To undermine the election system and faith in our elections even more, especially this year, where Democrats are expected to do well in a blue wave, correct?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you're right that states under the Constitution, states control election policy, and both of Trump's executive orders on voting are really unprecedented intrusions by the federal government into what the Constitution clearly says is an area of state authority. And so we expect that that's why they will both be blocked or struck down before the election. But yes, I think it's about causing confusion. And it's also, I think, about empowering local election officials or sometimes state election officials. But in Michigan, I'm thinking of your county clerks that are, some of whom are Democrats and some are Republicans.
Most of them are Republicans.
Okay, yeah. Who have, I think, a lot of leeway to interpret election rules, especially if they're being encouraged to do so by the federal government. And so that's another way to sort of insert mischief and confusion into the process. And I know you have one who's running for Secretary of State and who's making a lot of noise about the current election administration in Michigan being insecure and
right. Anthony Ferlini, who runs the Macomb County elections, which went for Trump all three times. So.
Right.
Yeah, it's really a very distressing time for election officials, and it has been for years because they're the ones who receive the brunt of anger from voters, especially during 2020 with all the conspiracies when Trump lost the election. And they're having to constantly deal with these changes to elections, which is highly stressful. And so I'm wondering, as somebody who covers these issues, how much stress can our elections take? Because the whole process and the people who keep this system running, many of whom are volunteers, has just been under enormous pressure for so many years. And how long can this be sustained?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to diminish that concern at all. I think it's very reasonable question to ask. And I've asked it myself, and our reporters have asked it at times of sort of election administration experts. And I'm thinking particularly of David Becker, who is one of the most renowned election administration experts, a former DOJ lawyer who created the ERIC system in which states share voter registration data so that they can remove voters who have moved from one state to another from their rolls, and became, as you may know, a subject of sort of conservative conspiracies. But he is quite confident that despite these threats and the difficult position that a lot of election administrators and workers are being put under by these false claims, that there are enough professionals to run elections smoothly, and that it's important for voters to know that and understand that and have confidence in the system. And it is worth pointing out that these concerns have been around, as you say, since 2020 or so. We've had smooth elections since then, despite problems in certain areas. So I think that's an important message for people to understand. But I think the concern about these sort of the pressure that this puts election officials and administrators under is not so much that it's going to make it impossible for them to administer a smooth election, but it's going to create a false belief among voters and people that this system isn't working or is rigged, and that leads people to think that their vote isn't going to count, or they shouldn't turn out, or to disengage with the process. And boosts efforts on the right to impose new restrictions on voting, of course.
Yeah. Well, Zach, what are some of the other stories that you are continuing to follow in this election year?
Gosh, we've talked about many of the big ones. We've been watching the California primaries, as I'm sure you have, and our sort of area of interest on that is in the governor's race. As you may have seen, one of the Republican candidates running was the sheriff in Riverside County, California, who seized 650,000 ballots from California's redistricting referendum last year, acting on sort of false claims from these anti-voting activists, and is being stopped eventually by California's court system. But he was running in the Republican, or in the California primary for governor. I think he looks like he's gotten about 10 or 11%. So he will not be advancing to the general, which was heartening to see that his candidacy was rejected. In the attorney general race in California, it's worth noting we've been covering a guy called Michael Gates, who was the number 2 until this year at DOJ in the Civil Rights Division, and helped to lead their effort to obtain all 50 states' voter rolls, which is another ongoing story we've been covering very closely. DOJ has sued 30 states plus Washington, D.C. now in an attempt to get access to their voter rolls. They've lost in all 8 of the cases where there has been a decision so far. Anyway, Michael Gates, who was part of that effort at DOJ, is now running for Attorney General in California and will be on the ballot for the general against the Democratic incumbent. He's not likely to win, but it's another, to us, I think, another indication of where the Republican Party is on these issues right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zach, what is the best way that people can find your work?
DemocracyDocket.com. And, you put up a couple of my stories, but I'm the managing editor. I don't write too much, but we have a whole team of reporters who are covering all of these stories, including the DOJ voter roll story I was just talking about. All of these redistricting fights that we've been talking about, Trump's executive orders on voting, the SAVE Act, which we covered very closely and seems to be dead for now, but we're always ready for it to come back. All of these voting and democracy stories that we cover very closely at democracydocket.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all of you for tuning in a little bit later on today for First Draft.